Hey, geography students. Today we are going to continue talking about development and what that means on a social scale. So we've already talked about the economic aspect of development or how advanced a country is in terms of quality of life uh, and standard of living. Now we're going to take a look at it from a social and demographic perspective. So let's take a look. All right, so a social indicator or something that tells us how developed a country is would be something that deals with their quality of life in terms of something as simple as how much education on average a person in that country gets. We take a look at their literacy rates or how often or how many are able to read or and write in that particular country. And so, one of the main statistics that we look at besides literacy rate is school life expectancy. And now that doesn't mean how long they're going to live in school. It means how long are they expected to stay in school for, or how many years of schooling are they going to get. Now, this stat can be a little bit confusing. This doesn't mean that they only go to school until they're 17 years old or only 13 years old. What this means is that they are, on average, the average student, in this case, male student, is going to be in school in Norway for 17 years. So, generally speaking, from probably 4 or 5 years old for another 17 years on top of that. So, we can assume that in Norway, most people, both male and female, are going to not only elementary through high school, they're also on average going to be going to college or some higher level university. And so when we compare that to a lesser developed country such as Afghanistan, we can assume that males are going to more likely going to go through the average K through 12 curriculum, maybe get through some general years of high school, um, but not go on much past that. So most people don't have the same level of education in Afghanistan as they do in a more developed country like Norway. And it's even lower for females in Afghanistan. And so we're going to talk more about that here in a minute. Gender plays a big factor in how developed a country is. And remember, we go back to using these indicators to tell how developed a country is, and we can rank those countries numerically using the HDI or Human Development Index that the UN uses to rank those countries. So this is another factor that goes into it. Additionally, we have things like our health and welfare systems in the different countries. So we know that all people get sick from time to time, and how we deal with that is a big indicator of the quality of life in that particular area. So how much or how many hospitals and clinics, how many doctors are available in that particular region? What's the affordability of healthcare in that area? It plays a big factor into it. So, can people actually access healthcare even if they are sick? Are they able to find a doctor? And if they can find a doctor, can they afford it? So, that's a big factor that we look into. We can tell a lot using other statistics that we'll talk more about in a minute when we look at demographics to tell how good a country's healthcare is. Not only that, a big part of your health and well-being, as you know, is going to be what you eat. How many calories do you get a day? Are those good quality calories? Do we have all the vitamins and nutrients in that food that we're eating to sustain us and live a healthy life? That's going to be a big part of it as well. When we look at the quality of life in a place, how much food and what type of food are they getting? Are they getting enough calories to really survive and thrive a healthy lifestyle? And then also we take a look at welfare services. Welfare is generally speaking taking care of people who can't help themselves. So that would be the very young, of course, but also the elderly and people that, for whatever reason, maybe they're handicapped, maybe they sustained an injury in war, whatever the case may be, protecting people that cannot necessarily make a complete living for themselves on their own. So people that can't work, how do the people that can work take care of those people? And so we take a look at those types of services. In our country, we have things like Medicare and Social Security and other types of government programs that assist people in those situations. And so we take a look at that for other countries as well. One of the biggest factors that indicates how developed a country is the empowerment of women. So how equal are women treated in a particular country compared to men? And we take a look at things like their economic empowerment. Do they have jobs? Are they able to work in the same type of fields as men? Do they have political power? Do they have a voice? Can they vote? Can they have any type of office? Can they run for office? What types of leaders do we have in the business world and the political world as far as it deals with women? We also are going to take a look at it from a demographic perspective as well, how women are handled as far as medical treatment, access to quality birthing facilities, and many other factors go into this measurement that the UN and other organizations use called the Gender Inequality Index. And basically, it uses a lot of different statistics to measure how equal men and women are in that country. And we're going to go into a lot of more detail on that, and you'll look into it for your particular country as well. So here's a couple of maps just to show you where the more literate areas. So this kind of tells you the education levels we obviously see in the North American regions, very high, as well as Europe and Central Asia as well. But when we start getting to Eastern and Southeastern Asia, and places like the Middle East, North Africa, and of course Sub-Saharan Africa, those literacy rates are much, much lower. And that tells us and gives us a good indicator of the level of education on average that people attain. This isn't to say that everybody here is illiterate, of course, but on average, are people able to go to school long enough to learn how to read and write, which we think of as very basic, but that is not necessarily the case in other places around the world. And we can see that from this map. All right, this one also in the same sense, we take food for granted a lot of times because it's so plentiful here in the United States. But many people around the world, as you can tell from this map, exist on less than 2,000 or even 1,000, oftentimes calories per day, which we know that the bare minimum requirement for a diet, according to the U.S., is a 2,000 calorie diet. And as you can tell, many people do not even get that amount. And so that's tough for us to understand, but nutrition is a big part of quality of life. All right, and finally, this one takes a look at gender. How well are women treated and how equal are they to men in these particular societies? So we can tell that the U.S. Is not at the very top, like you might assume that we are. A big reason is political empowerment. And a lot of these countries, including Germany and others, have women leaders as their prime minister, or like the UK as well, Theresa May, Angela Merkel in Germany. Many of these have political leaders who are women, but to this day, we struggle to elect more women to political office, and in business as well. We're seeing more and more, but we have not gotten to the level of the countries in the darkest green. And in the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, women have even less rights and less equality as it compares to men. And part of that is cultural, and a part of that is just because they are needed to work in the homes. And in those poorer regions, a lot of them still work as subsistence farmers. So in that sense, they don't have a lot of rights and are not treated as equal to men. And so you can tell the development of countries around the world based on that gender equality as well. Additionally, we can take a look at other indicators of development as well, such as demographic indicators. And so these go hand in hand a lot of times with the social indicators. And we take a look at how a population is distributed and some key factors that we talked about in our population unit. If you can remember, we took a look at things like life expectancy. How long on average are people living in certain areas of the world? In Japan, it's one of the highest, at 85 years on average you're going to live. The US, you can see here, 80 on average. But when you start moving into Sub-Saharan Africa, that drops off significantly. In other lesser developed countries around the world, life expectancy on average is only 54, which is much better than it was, but still nowhere near the more developed country rate, as you can tell here from the other examples. Another big part of it is how many women and children die during childbirth or in their first years after childbirth. And so the infant or maternal mortality ratio, IMR or MMR, as you'll sometimes see it abbreviated, is a big indicator of the quality of healthcare in that particular country. So, obviously, if people are dying in childbirth, kids aren't living to certain ages, that's not a good indicator of the quality of healthcare in that particular region. We also look at other factors that we talked about in the population unit, like total fertility rate or how many kids on average women have in a particular country. We know that in lesser developed countries, they need to have more kids because they need that extra income that those kids provide, either on the farm or in other jobs to provide for their families. And so we see the fertility rate in women in lesser developed countries much higher, above the 2.1 replacement rate in countries. So we start seeing numbers even as high as 10 or 11 in certain regions of the world. And we see that in more developed countries, that number gets closer and closer to that 2.1 replacement rate as the number of kids needed decreases. And we also know that kids become expensive as a country develops, and so it's more mouths to feed, and they take that perception of kids when countries develop. And so we can see this in our demographic transition model as well. As countries develop and industrialize, they move along the same path that we talked about. They grow very rapidly in stage 2 and 3. Remember, stage 2 is going to be like your sub-Saharan Africa countries, in your developing countries around the world, Papua New Guinea. Then eventually it starts to level off here, and we start seeing a slowdown, but it's still growing in stage 3. And then it's finally stationary or not changing here in stage 4, and we see stable growth or very low growth here in stage 4. In some countries, such as Japan that we've talked about, are even starting to decline. We call that stage 5, and the populations are declining even more so. And so one of the big things that we look at is dependency ratio. And so that's going to be how many people are working compared to how many people are not working. So the very young that can't work and the very old that can no longer work. And so if that dependency ratio is too high, it can be a huge problem. You want it to be about roughly 50%. That would be the ideal form. Now, in the US, it is roughly 50%. In Japan, it's higher because they have an aging population, a very high elderly population that can't work anymore. And so it's a struggle for the people that are working, that aren't elderly or too young, to provide for that many people. In the same sense in Nigeria, although it's a little reversed because it's all young people that they're trying to take care of, or those dependents. And the working age classes makes up only 12% of the entire population. You can see that by these population pyramids. Notice Japan has a high elderly population they have to take care of. Nigeria has a very large young dependent ratio that they're having to take care of, while the United States is more or less average. It's the same number of dependents as there are working age in the United States. And so that's where you want to be, but it can cause some problems on either side of that scale. All right, so lastly, let's take a look at world regions. What's it like in different areas of the world in terms of development? So here are our regions that we're going to take a look at. English North America, notice we don't lump the Caribbean or Mexico in with North America there. We classify them more culturally as Latin America in that perceptual region. Take a look at some of the others. This is how we're going to break them down, and we have them set into these particular regions. Now, the highest level of HDI, by the way, all these numbers are in HDI, or Human Development Index. English North America is going to be your highest. That's US and Canada, followed by Western Europe is a close second. That's going to be countries like Spain and France and others. And Oceania, including Australia and New Zealand, also in the highest level of development in terms of regionality. Now, once you get to Eastern Europe, that's going to be your Poland and Ukraine and Russia. Those are a little bit lower than Western Europe, but still in that developed region. As well as in East Asia, that would be your China, Koreas, and Japan. Notice Japan is much higher on average than the rest of them, though. If Japan was alone, it would be set up here with these highest developed countries. Now, Latin America, the Caribbean, and that same region. Now, notice our lowest three regions, the Middle East and North Africa. Those two areas are um, obviously more developed than sub-Saharan Africa, but still classified in some of our lowest, as well as South Asia, which includes India, and then Southeast Asia here, such as Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, etc. All right, so those are our least developed regions here in yellow, our developing regions here in green, and the most developed regions here in the light blue. Here's another depiction individual country-wise as to what that looks like. So take a look at that map and make sure you're clear on any of those particular areas. All right, lastly here, this is something that geographers have tended to use and classify countries as well. We don't use it as much anymore, but it is interesting to note that you could draw a line of development using this red line here to show the more developed countries versus the lesser developed countries. The only exception would be down there in Oceania with Australia and New Zealand. But everywhere above this red line would be more developed, while everywhere below this red line would typically be classified as lesser developed. So, like I said, we don't use this as much anymore, but it is an interesting way to look at the world in terms of development.